Chapter 1. The Unlikely Assignment. The stars stretched endlessly in the deep expanse of the galaxy, a field of fire in the blackness of space. As the Terran Commonwealth's freighter Lucid Star sailed through the void, its engines humming with a smooth, almost imperceptible sound that reverberated through the metal skeleton of the ship. The vessel was bound for Isther, a world that existed far outside the normal routes of galactic commerce, a world known more for its isolation than for any political or economic influence. To most of the galaxy, Isther was a place of mystery, a realm of beauty, intellect, and unspoken customs, a place where visitors were rare, and when they did come, it was always on the Istheri's own terms. The Isther had never sought to conquer, colonize, or even interact with other species on a widespread scale. Their society was built on deep intellectual pursuits, meditation, and an understanding of nature that was far more refined than anything humans had encountered. For centuries, the Isther had kept to themselves, existing in quiet peace. Yet now, for reasons unknown, they had agreed to a diplomatic exchange with the humans, a process that would introduce their species to one another in a way that would challenge not only their understanding of each other, but also their very beliefs about relationships and connection. Shtara, like many of her peers, had never expected to be a part of such an exchange. She was quiet, introspective, and far more comfortable within the familiar boundaries of her own culture. Raised in the sacred city of Telsera, a place known for its serene lakes and ethereal temples, she had always found peace in the solitude of her surroundings. Her people, the Isther, were not prone to outward displays of emotion, preferring intellectual pursuits, delicate arts, and quiet reflection. From a young age, Shtara had been taught that the true path to understanding was through introspection and thought, that physicality and passion were things that should be approached with great caution, even reverence. Relationships, in the Istheri sense, were about balance, understanding, and connection on a spiritual and intellectual level. Physical affection, when it occurred, was subtle, delicate, and never the primary focus of any interaction. However, when Shtara's name had been drawn from the list of volunteers to participate in the human exchange program, she had been both stunned and deeply apprehensive. It wasn't that she disliked humans. On the contrary, she had heard stories from the diplomats and scholars who had interacted with the Terran species, and there were elements of their boldness and willingness to take risks that intrigued her. But Shtara had never been good at speaking to new people, especially those who were so different from her own kind. The idea of being assigned a human companion for an extended period of time, someone she would be expected to learn from, teach, and potentially form some kind of bond with, was utterly overwhelming. Her parents, sensing her hesitation, had been supportive but firm in their encouragement. "This is an opportunity, Shtara," her mother had said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet insistence. "You will learn much about yourself through this experience. Remember, growth comes from stepping outside of what is familiar." Her father, ever the intellectual, had added, "The Terrans are unlike us in many ways, but their curiosity and adaptability could provide invaluable insights into your own understanding of connection. Go explore. Don't shy away from the unknown." But Shtara wasn't sure she wanted to explore. The unknown seemed like a vast, frightening place where every part of her quiet, introspective nature would be pushed to its breaking point. Still, when the time came for her to board the Lucid Star, the sleek human vessel that would carry her away from Isther and into the unknown depths of human culture, she could not turn back. The sleek metallic corridors of the ship seemed cold and foreign to her, the hum of machinery echoing in her ears as she moved through the vessel, an unfamiliar landscape filled with the sounds of human voices, their language a complex symphony of sounds that often left her struggling to understand the nuances. She had spent years studying the Terran language, of course, and while she had a basic understanding, it was the subtle emotions behind the words, the rapid fluctuations in tone, the warmth and sometimes harshness that eluded her. The humans themselves were a mystery. Their bodies were so different from hers, so solid. She was used to her own form, which was sleek and graceful, almost fluid in its movements, with skin that shimmered like light on the surface of water. Humans were muscular, and their features were blunt, broad compared to the delicate features of her own species. And yet, For all their physical differences, she had been told that humans had something Isther lacked: an innate ability to connect, to form bonds quickly and intensely, with little to no reservation. That, more than anything, intrigued her, even as it terrified her. As the lucid star made its way toward Isther's orbital station, Shtara found herself alone in her quarters, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts and emotions. The quiet hum of the engines was the only sound in the room, and outside her porthole, the stars stretched out into infinity. She had always found comfort in the stars. Something about their timelessness, their vastness, made her feel small in the most comforting way. But tonight, the stars felt like a heavy weight on her chest. She was about to meet her human counterpart, her assigned partner for the duration of the exchange. What would he be like? Would he be kind, as the Terran diplomats had suggested? Or would he be loud, brash, and difficult to understand, as some of the stories she had heard suggested? She was a shy Isthari girl, unaccustomed to the rapid pace of human social interactions. How would she ever manage to bridge the gap between their worlds, to make herself understood, to form some kind of connection? The sound of the door sliding open interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find a human standing there, tall, broad-shouldered, and with an air of confidence that immediately made her feel even smaller, even more unsure of herself. His features were as different from hers as could be imagined, and yet, there was something about his presence that drew her in. His dark eyes, though intense, were not unkind. He smiled when he saw her, a gesture that was so open, so genuine, that Shtara's heart skipped a beat. The human was clearly in his mid-20s, younger than many of the diplomats she had met during her time at the embassy, and his appearance was nothing like what she had imagined. He was dressed simply, wearing a loose-fitting shirt and trousers, far more casual than the stiff ceremonial attire of the Isther. "Hello," he said, his voice warm but tinged with nervousness, as if he were just as uncertain of this encounter as she was. "I'm David. It's good to finally meet you, Shtara." Shtara's throat tightened, and she found herself unable to speak at first, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had prepared for this, studied the cultural protocols and practiced her Terran speech, but now that the moment had arrived, words seemed inadequate. She stood there, frozen, unsure of how to respond. Her instincts told her to retreat, to find a safe, quiet corner of her mind and hide there until the moment passed. But she had learned long ago that growth only came through confronting her fears, and so, slowly, she took a deep breath and spoke. "Hello," she said softly, her voice a little unsure but steady enough. "I am Shtara. It is good to meet you too." David's smile widened slightly, and there was something in his expression, a flicker of understanding, of patience that made her heart settle, even if only for a moment. He stepped forward slightly, not encroaching on her space, but offering an openness that made her feel more at ease. "I've heard a lot about the Isther," David said, his voice lighter now, as if trying to ease the tension between them. "I think we're going to have a great time learning from each other." Shtara couldn't help but notice the sincerity in his words, and for the first time since she had boarded the Lucid Star, she felt a small spark of hope. Maybe this wouldn't be as difficult as she had feared. Maybe, just maybe, she could learn something from him, something beyond what she had expected. But one thing was already clear. This human, with his warmth and openness, was not like the men of her own species. His presence was not delicate or subtle. It was bold, and in its own way, it made her feel more alive than she had in years. And yet, as she glanced at him again, there was another sensation that crept into her thoughts, something she couldn't quite explain. Something about his presence, his size, his energy. It was so different from the men of her own people. Something about him was big, and it stirred something deep inside her, a feeling that was foreign, unfamiliar, but undeniable. She took another deep breath, looking into his eyes as she slowly began to understand that, for all the differences between their worlds, there was something unspoken, something profound between them. Something that would change her life in ways she never could have predicted. As the silence stretched between them, Shtara couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more to this encounter than she had anticipated. Her species had long prided itself on subtlety, grace, and intellectual connection, yet here she was, confronted with the raw and unfiltered presence of a human, someone whose energy was like a heavy presence in the room. She had read all about humans before coming aboard the Lucid Star, their customs, their ways of thinking, their history. She knew their social norms were more direct, more physical, more loud than those of her people. And yet, she had underestimated just how different it would feel to be face to face with one. David, standing across from her, seemed so big. Not just in stature, although he was certainly taller than her and much more solid in build than any Isthari male she had ever known, but in a way that went beyond physical appearance. It was in the energy that seemed to emanate from him, the way his presence filled the space around him, making her feel, for a brief moment, almost fragile in comparison. His dark hair was cut short, and his eyes, though kind, were full of the unrestrained curiosity that humans were known for, curiosity that seemed to pull at her, making her want to retreat even as she wanted to stay. She had never been good at dealing with such an open, unguarded gaze. Isthari culture prized a form of understanding through subtlety, through the deep spaces between words and actions. David, on the other hand, radiated a sort of openness, as though there were no hidden meanings, no layers of intricacy. What you saw was what you got. Her heart raced as her thoughts scattered, a mixture of curiosity and confusion swarming her mind. She had spent years learning about human nature, the way they built their connections, the forceful passion they often attached to their relationships. But this wasn't about intellectual knowledge. This was raw, unfiltered human presence. For the first time since her arrival, she felt completely out of her depth. She wanted to hide, to disappear into the soft glow of the ship's metal walls, but she knew, deep down, that this was exactly why she had been chosen for this exchange. This was her opportunity to learn, to grow beyond her reserved and introverted self, to experience the very thing that her people had long been hesitant to approach. Human connection was chaotic, impulsive, and deeply physical, and for someone like Shtara, who had never let her emotions surface in such a way, it was overwhelming. As the seconds ticked by, David's easy smile faltered slightly as he realized that she wasn't responding the way he had expected. His head tilted slightly to one side, and Shtara noticed how his brow furrowed, a mix of concern and curiosity crossing his face. She could feel his eyes on her, but rather than being uncomfortable, as she had expected, she found herself drawn into the intensity of his gaze. It was warm, inviting, and surprisingly gentle for someone whose species was known for being bold and unrestrained. He wasn't judging her, wasn't pushing her to speak or act in any particular way. He was simply there, waiting. Shtara swallowed, gathering her thoughts before she spoke again. I apologize, she said softly, the words leaving her mouth with difficulty. I wasn't expecting this level of presence. David blinked in confusion before he let out a soft laugh, his eyes sparkling with understanding. I guess I can come off that way sometimes, he said, his voice warm with humor. But you don't have to apologize. I think we're both trying to figure this out, right? He shifted on his feet, the casualness of his posture making her feel a little less tense. I know this is all new, and maybe a little overwhelming, but I want you to know that I'm not here to make you uncomfortable. I'm here to learn from you too, Shtara. For a moment, Shtara didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to the blunt honesty in his words, nor the simple way he presented himself. In Isthar society, one was always careful with their words, careful with their intentions, as though the smallest action could have far-reaching consequences. But David wasn't like that. He was direct, and yet there was a gentleness in his approach that made her feel strangely at ease. It wasn't like the subtle games of politeness she had always known. It was something new, something more real. She nodded slowly, a tentative smile pulling at the corner of her lips. I appreciate that. I suppose I have much to learn as well. It is just difficult, sometimes, being in the presence of someone so different. She paused, unsure if her words had conveyed the complexity of what she was feeling. We, the Isthar, are not used to this type of openness. We connect differently. David's eyes softened at her words, and for a moment, the tension that had filled the room seemed to dissipate. He nodded, his expression understanding. Yeah, I get that. I think humans tend to be pretty open, sometimes to a fault, he said with a chuckle. We don't always think about how it might feel for others. But that's why we're doing this, right? To understand each other better. His words rang in Shtara's mind like a bell. Understanding. That was the purpose of this exchange. But how could they truly understand each other when their worlds were so fundamentally different? It was as though they were speaking two entirely different languages, each filled with meanings and emotions that the other could barely comprehend. And yet, the more she listened to him, the more she realized that perhaps this was the point. Understanding didn't have to mean becoming the same. It didn't mean erasing the differences that existed between them. It meant finding a way to communicate, to connect across those differences, to learn from each other in ways that neither species had ever done before. The realization was both terrifying and exciting, and Shtara felt a flutter in her chest as she looked at him, the human standing before her. "You are right," she said softly. "We do have much to learn. But perhaps that is the beginning of something important." David grinned, his smile wide and easy. "I think you're right about that." The air between them shifted then, a kind of unspoken agreement forming in the space. Shtara had no idea what the future held for them, what this exchange would bring, but for the first time since boarding the Lucid Star, she felt a small sense of possibility. She wasn't sure what it would look like, but she knew it was a path she had to walk. For better or worse, this was the beginning of something new, something strange, and maybe even a little frightening. But it was also a beginning. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Tension. Days passed in a blur as Shtara and David settled into the routine of their exchange. The ship, though small compared to the Isthari craft, felt like a new world to Shtara. She marveled at the technology, so different from the organic ships of her people. The walls of the ship were sleek, metallic, and humbly adorned, with human artifacts scattered around the room in seemingly random fashion. The difference in culture was immediately apparent. The Isthar preferred to keep their environments quiet, serene, and meticulously ordered, while humans seemed to thrive in environments that were cluttered, lived in, as though their very presence left an imprint everywhere they went. Each day, Shtara and David spent hours together, getting to know one another, learning each other's customs, and attempting to bridge the vast gaps in understanding. The conversations were awkward at first, filled with moments of silence as they both struggled to find a common language both literally and figuratively. But over time, the awkwardness began to fade, replaced by an easy rhythm. Shtara began to appreciate David's humor, his candidness, and the way he never seemed to judge her, even when she faltered in her words or hesitated in her actions. But it wasn't just the language that was difficult for her. There was an undeniable tension that Shtara couldn't ignore, a growing feeling that stirred deep within her every time David was near. She had never experienced anything like it in her life. The Isthar were a reserved people, their relationships based on intellectual and spiritual connections that transcended physical attraction. The very idea of physical intimacy was something that had always been secondary. But with David, there was something different, something unfamiliar. His presence, his size, his energy, it all seemed to pull at her in ways she could neither explain nor understand. And it wasn't just his physicality. It was the way he looked at her, the way his eyes seemed to see right through her, making her feel exposed in ways she had never felt before. There was something magnetic about him, something that made her heart race whenever he was close, and yet, it was terrifying. The Isthari did not act on these kinds of impulses. They did not allow such desires to cloud their judgment. But as the days passed, Shtara found herself drawn to him more and more, unable to ignore the tension building between them. She knew she had to confront it, to understand what was happening inside her, but she wasn't sure how. She had spent her entire life learning to control her emotions, to keep them in check, to not let them overtake her. But David's presence was breaking down those walls, piece by piece. One evening, after a long day of discussion and learning about each other's cultures, they found themselves alone on the observation deck, staring out at the vast expanse of space. The stars stretched out in every direction, beautiful and infinite, and for a moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the ship around them. David was standing close, just a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the stars. Shtara couldn't help but notice the way the light reflected in his dark eyes, how his form seemed so solid, so grounded in the universe. She felt her pulse quicken, her thoughts racing as she tried to push away the feelings rising within her. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to live among the stars?" David asked, breaking the silence between them. Shtara turned to look at him, startled by his sudden question. "I've always been fascinated by the stars," she admitted. but to actually live out there. It is something beyond what I have imagined. David smiled, a soft, thoughtful smile. Maybe it's not so different from what we already do. We're all just floating through space, trying to make sense of it all. Stara nodded, but her attention was elsewhere on him, on the energy between them, the way her heart was beating faster as he stepped just a little closer. It was as if the space between them had become impossibly small, and she could feel his presence like a weight on her chest. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. David, her voice was soft, almost hesitant. There is something I do not understand. David's gaze turned to her, his expression curious but patient. What is it? She struggled to find the right words, her mind a jumble of thoughts and emotions. It is how I feel when you are near. How I feel when you look at me. She paused, unsure of how to continue. I am confused. David's expression softened, and without a word, he took a step closer, his proximity almost overwhelming. You don't have to be confused, Stara, he said gently. We're learning together. This doesn't have to be complicated. Stara felt the heat rise in her cheeks as his words settled in the space between them, and for a moment, she wondered if she was making a mistake, if she should step back, retreat into the safety of her familiar world. But then she realized that there was something else at play here, something deeper than the fear she felt. It was the chance to truly connect with another being, to learn from him and with him, to explore the unknown parts of herself that had always remained hidden. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most terrifying thing of all. Chapter 2. The Struggle Between Worlds. The next few days passed in an uncomfortable tension, as if both of them were walking a thin line between the comfort of their shared learning and the discomfort of something deeper, something more complex that neither of them had fully addressed. Stara spent long hours in her quarters, contemplating her feelings, and though she had tried to push the thoughts of David from her mind, she found that she could not. His presence was overwhelming in the most confusing way. She had never before been so affected by someone else. David, for his part, seemed to pick up on her quiet distance, but he said nothing, respecting her space while continuing their sessions, offering her a kind smile, a gentle gesture when their paths crossed. He was patient with her, never rushing her, never pushing her into something she wasn't ready for. And yet, the tension between them lingered, unspoken and undeniable. It was during one of their evening sessions on the observation deck, when they were once again staring out at the stars, that the moment finally came. David turned to her, his eyes soft but intent. Stara, he said, his voice low and warm, as if this was something he had been thinking about for a long time. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I feel like there's something between us. Something that's been growing, and I think it's time we talked about it. Stara's heart skipped a beat. She had been dreading this moment, yet somehow knew it was inevitable. Her voice faltered as she looked at him, her mind racing, her emotions tangled in confusion and uncertainty. David, But he interrupted gently, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It's okay, Stara. We're not going to rush this. But I want you to know that I care about you. And whatever happens, I'm here for you. I'll always be here, no matter what. Her breath caught in her throat. She had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable, and yet there was a part of her that longed to acknowledge the truth. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him any longer. The connection between them had grown too strong to ignore. The question was no longer if she would give in to it, but when and whether or not she could find the strength to face what lay beyond that. And in that moment, as their eyes locked, Stara realized that the greatest journey she would face wasn't in understanding humans or their ways, but in understanding herself. Stara stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as David's words lingered in the air. There it was, the truth that had been building between them for days. She had known it, had felt it, but hearing him say it aloud made it real in a way that terrified her. It wasn't just the words, though. It was the way he had looked at her, soft, patient, understanding. His eyes didn't demand anything from her. They didn't push her, but they had a warmth to them that made her feel seen in a way no one ever had before. She had always been careful, had always kept her distance from others, especially when it came to emotions. But here, standing before this human, her walls felt fragile, as if they were crumbling under the weight of her own vulnerability. Her breath came in short gasps, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure what to say. The Isther had always taught her to think before speaking, to choose her words with precision, but now her mind was a jumbled mess. She could feel the warmth rising in her cheeks, a blush that was foreign to her, her Istery features reacting in ways she didn't fully understand. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She wasn't supposed to be this affected by a human by David. He was everything she had been taught to be cautious of. He was bold, direct, and physical in a way that her people would never dream of. And yet, there was something about him that made her want to abandon her reserve, to let go of the intellectual distance that had defined her entire life. She didn't want to feel this pull toward him, didn't want to be so overwhelmed by the idea of connection, but the more she resisted, the more it became impossible to ignore. David took a cautious step closer, his expression soft but still filled with that same quiet intensity. He didn't speak, just stood there, waiting for her, giving her space to process. Shtara could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the gentle warmth of his presence, and for the first time, she felt something shift within herself. She wasn't sure what it was. Was it fear? Or something deeper, something more vulnerable than anything she had ever felt before? It was confusing, but it was also comforting. She took a slow, deliberate breath and finally broke the silence. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt small in this moment, smaller than she had ever felt before. In her world, she had always been in control, always able to navigate social situations with grace and precision. But this was new. This was raw. I wasn't expecting this. I wasn't expecting you. David's lips curved into a small, understanding smile. I didn't expect to be here either, he said gently, his voice low and sincere. I didn't expect to feel this, connected to you, Shtara. But I do. And I don't want to rush you. You don't have to say anything if you're not ready. I just want you to know that I'm here. For you. The simplicity of his words, the honesty in his voice, cut through the layers of uncertainty that had clouded her mind. She had been so caught up in the differences between their species, the inherent contradictions between her Istery nature and his human presence, that she hadn't fully realized how much she longed for connection. For the first time in years, she felt her walls begin to crumble, piece by piece. The deep, unspoken connection she had feared was not something to run from. It was something to embrace, to explore. I don't understand it, Shtara whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she looked up at him, feeling the rush of emotions overwhelm her. I don't understand how this could be possible. You are so different from us. David stepped forward again, and this time, she didn't step back. I know, he said softly, his voice reassuring. I know we're different. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from each other. That doesn't mean we can't find a way to be something more. Together. His words settled into her heart, resonating in a way she couldn't explain. She had always been taught that differences were barriers, that connection could only come from a place of intellectual alignment. But what if she had been wrong? What if connection wasn't about sameness? What if it was about overcoming those differences, about finding understanding in the spaces where their worlds collided? Shtara lifted her gaze to meet his, the weight of the decision before her clearer now than it had ever been. There was a part of her that was terrified to allow herself to feel this way, to let go of the controlled, intellectual life she had always known. But there was also a part of her something deeper that knew she couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything she had learned in these few short days. Not after seeing how real the connection between them was. I think I want to understand, Shtara said slowly, her voice more confident now. She wasn't sure what this would mean for her, for their relationship, but she knew she couldn't deny the pull any longer. I want to try. David's expression softened further, and for a brief moment, Shtara saw a glimmer of relief in his eyes. Then we'll take it slow, he said, his voice gentle but filled with an underlying determination. No rush. No pressure. Just, whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. She nodded, feeling the smallest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The weight on her chest, the uncertainty that had gnawed at her for days, seemed to lift slightly. She didn't have all the answers. In fact, she had no idea what the future would hold, or where this connection would lead. But for the first time, she felt like she could face it. With David by her side, perhaps there was a way forward that didn't require her to be perfect or to understand everything at once. The ship continued its quiet hum around them, the stars outside still distant and cold. But within the quiet space of the observation deck, Shtara and David stood together, the first steps of their shared journey stretching out before them, uncertain but full of possibility. Chapter 3. The Distance Between Us. In the days that followed, Shtara and David began to settle into a rhythm. Their conversations became easier, more natural, as they learned to navigate the vast cultural differences that had initially separated them. Shtara found herself more comfortable in David's presence, his warmth and openness slowly beginning to break down the walls she had spent her entire life building. She had always believed that intellectual connections were the deepest form of understanding, but David was teaching her that emotional connections, raw, unfiltered, held a power of their own. The more time they spent together, the more Shtara began to appreciate the simple gestures that David made. He was always patient, always gentle, never pushing her too far out of her comfort zone, but encouraging her nonetheless. When they shared meals together, he would ask her questions about her people, about her culture, always eager to learn more. And when he spoke about his own human experiences, his family, and his life back on Earth, Shtara found herself fascinated by the way he viewed the world. It was a perspective so different from her own, yet it was undeniably compelling. And yet, despite the growing connection between them, there were small moments, when Shtara couldn't help but feel the distance that still lay between them. It was a distance not of space or physicality, but of understanding. Though they were both learning, though they were both growing in their connection, Shtara couldn't shake the feeling that she was still a little bit behind. There were times when she felt the pull of her own culture, the weight of history customs, and she found herself wondering if David could ever fully understand her. The tension between their worlds, their lives, their cultures, though it had lessened, it hadn't disappeared. And there were times, especially late at night when the ship was silent and still, that she wondered if the barriers between them would ever truly vanish. One evening, as they sat in the common room, watching a human documentary about Earth's history, Shtara felt the familiar ache of uncertainty settle in her chest once more. She turned to look at David, who was fully engrossed in the screen, but when he caught her gaze, his expression softened. There was no need for words. He could always tell when something was on her mind. "What's bothering you, Shtara?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Shtara hesitated, the vulnerability of the question pressing against her. "I'm still not sure about all of this," she admitted quietly, her voice almost lost in the quiet hum of the ship. "There are times when I feel connected to you, but there are also times when I feel like we are miles apart. Our worlds are so different. Our lives are so different. I'm not sure how to reconcile that." David didn't speak right away. He turned his body slightly toward her, his gaze unwavering. Then, in the quietest of voices, he said, "I think that's what makes this so special. We're different. And that's okay. Maybe we'll never fully understand each other. But that doesn't mean we can't try. That doesn't mean we can't find a way to be together, even with the distance between us." Shtara's heart skipped a beat. His words resonated with something deep inside her. For the first time, she realized that the distance wasn't something to fear or resent. It was something to explore, to embrace. The journey wasn't about eliminating differences, it was about learning to walk through them, together. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most beautiful thing of all. In the days that followed, Shtara and David's connection continued to grow, yet with each step forward came a quiet pull back, as if there was an invisible barrier she couldn't cross completely. The closer they became, the more Shtara began to understand just how much she had been holding back, how much of her own culture and beliefs she had kept hidden, not just from David, but from herself. Her people, the Isther, valued intellect, subtlety, and the slow, patient weaving of relationships. Physical connection was seen as secondary, a final, delicate step that came only after an understanding of the deeper layers of a person. And yet, here she was with David, an emotional, passionate, and ever-curious human, whose very presence made her heart race in ways she couldn't explain. Her body reacted to him in ways she had never expected, with feelings and sensations she couldn't process, feelings that were not born of intellect, but of something far more primal. Every touch, every glance, felt heightened. Even something as simple as sitting next to him on the ship's observation deck sent a jolt of awareness through her. She wasn't used to such raw, unfiltered proximity. It was disorienting, and yet, there was a part of her that longed for more, that wanted to break free of the self-imposed restrictions she had carried for her entire life. But as much as she wanted to reach out, to cross that line, there was still that lingering uncertainty. What if she wasn't meant for this? What if, in the end, their differences were too great to overcome? What if the pull between them, this connection that felt so strong, was merely a fleeting moment, an illusion that would fade as quickly as it had arrived? David, for his part, seemed to sense her hesitation, and though he never pressured her, there were moments when his patience wore thin, when his longing for a deeper connection made his presence more intense. Shtara could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at her, as though he saw right through her carefully constructed walls. It was unnerving, but it was also something she couldn't ignore. He had become more than just her assigned companion. He had become a mirror, reflecting parts of herself she had long hidden, parts that were both terrifying and beautiful. She had never allowed herself to be vulnerable, not in this way, not with anyone. And yet, here she was, standing on the precipice of something she couldn't fully understand, let alone control. One evening, after another long day of learning about human culture and discussing their respective species, Shtara found herself once again alone with David. They had been sitting together, discussing the idea of physical affection and intimacy, when the conversation shifted to something deeper, something far more personal. David was watching her intently, his gaze soft but unwavering. "Tell me, Shtara," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "What's it like for you? Being a part of the Isthri way of life, I mean. What do you feel when you think about relationships? About intimacy?" Shtara hesitated, the question making her uncomfortable in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her thoughts scrambled, searching for the right words, but they felt inadequate. How could she explain the complexity of her emotions? How could she put into words the way her people had conditioned her to view connection as something quiet, something almost sacred, that should never be rushed or forced? She had been taught that intimacy was something earned, something that grew slowly, over time. But with David, things were moving so much faster than she was used to. We view connection differently," she said slowly, her voice quieter now. "In my culture, intimacy is something that evolves. It isn't about rushing towards something physical, it's about understanding the other person deeply, learning their mind, their soul, before anything else. The physical part, it comes later. After." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get it," he said softly. "Humans, we're different. We tend to be more direct. We act on our feelings, sometimes too quickly. But that doesn't mean we don't want depth, too. For me, it's not just about the physical. It's about building something real, something lasting. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. I don't want to rush you." Shtara felt a warmth in her chest at his words, a small flicker of relief. David wasn't pushing her, wasn't demanding anything. He was simply being there, offering his understanding, his patience. It made her feel safe. "I don't know how to be open like that," Shtara confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always been taught to control my emotions, to keep them in check, to not act on them impulsively. It's difficult for me to express myself this way." David's expression softened even more, and he reached out to gently touch her hand. The warmth of his touch sent a rush of feelings through her, feelings she couldn't quite put into words. "You don't have to express yourself all at once, Shtara. I'm not asking for everything. We can take it slow, at your pace. You just have to trust me." His words, simple yet profound, hung in the air between them. Shtara closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the weight of them. She had spent so much of her life holding back, keeping her distance from others, never allowing herself to truly feel. But David's patience, his understanding, was breaking down the walls she had built so carefully around herself. Maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. Maybe she could open herself up to the possibility of something more. When she opened her eyes again, she found him watching her with a tenderness that made her heart swell. It was an expression of kindness, not demand, not desire, but something deeper, something that made her feel as if he understood her in a way that no one else had. "I'll try," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll try, David. I don't know how, but I want to." David smiled, and for the first time, Shtara saw a look of genuine relief cross his face. He squeezed her hand gently, his voice filled with a quiet promise. "We'll take it one step at a time. No pressure. Just us. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." The air between them felt different now, more open, more honest. Shtara didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like maybe just maybe she could face it. She could face him. Chapter 4. The Unseen Connection. The following weeks seemed to pass in a blur, as Shtara and David's connection deepened in ways that neither of them had anticipated. The physical distance between them gradually diminished, replaced by an emotional closeness that neither culture had prepared them for. Shtara had never been taught how to navigate relationships in the way that humans did, but with David, it felt natural. He was patient, understanding, and never once made her feel as though she had to be something she wasn't. He respected her boundaries, but he also gently encouraged her to step beyond the walls she had spent years building around her heart. They began to spend more time together, not just learning about each other's cultures, but sharing their personal stories, the things that made them who they were. Shtara found herself slowly opening up, sharing pieces of her past, of her upbringing in the Isthari culture, and the philosophies that had shaped her worldview. David listened attentively, never interrupting, always asking questions that showed how genuinely interested he was in understanding her, in understanding the things that made her unique. And as time went on, Shtara began to realize something important. The tension that had once existed between them, those subtle differences in how they saw the world, how they experienced emotion, wasn't a barrier. It was something that enriched their connection, something that allowed them to learn from each other, to grow together. One evening, after a particularly long day spent in each other's company, David turned to her, his eyes soft, but filled with something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. "Shtara," he said, his voice a little shaky, as though he were trying to find the right words. "I know we've both been taking things slow, and that's been great. But I just want you to know that, no matter what happens, I care about you. A lot. And I'm really glad we've had this chance to get to know each other." Shtara's heart skipped a beat at his words, and for the first time, she felt her own emotions stir in a way that wasn't forced, wasn't controlled. She had always kept her feelings in check, never allowing them to spill over. But now, as she looked at David, this human, who had patiently unraveled the layers of her heart, she realized that her feelings for him were no longer something to fear. They were real, they were deep, and they were just beginning. "I care about you, too, David," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with the truth of her feelings. "I never thought I would feel this way, but I do, and I'm glad we're doing this together." David smiled, his expression filled with relief and happiness. He stepped closer, gently reaching out to touch her hand, his fingers warm and reassuring. And in that simple touch, in that quiet moment, Shtara felt something shift within herself. She no longer feared the unknown. She no longer feared the distance between their worlds. What mattered was what they had between them now, a connection that transcended their differences, a bond that was stronger than anything either of them had ever known. And as they stood there, facing each other, Shtara realized that, for the first time in her life, she was no longer just an Isthari girl. She was something more. She was a part of something greater, something shared between two beings from two different worlds. And that was a connection worth embracing, no matter where it would lead them.